Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 21. The private jet was packed, and the flight attendants took their seats after their safety demonstration as they started moving. Scylla was still in shock, melancholy from agreeing to leave the concert behind. She felt like a part of her was just ripped away and left behind. The musician took a window seat. She'd continue to stare out the small panel as they started to take off. When they lifted off almost right away, she spotted the venue. She saw her stage, her world that she was walking away from, getting smaller and smaller. She sighed, exhausted and overwhelmed. Not realizing the bodyguard sat next to her, Riel's voice broke the silence when she asked, "Are you okay?" "No, I'm scared. I can't believe this is happening." But she answered, "Yeah," instead. It was dark by the time the plane landed at the small airfield. Riel had to squint to see the black truck waiting for them. As Porter and Byron began helping the flight attendants with the luggage, Riel hurried down the steps of the plane and made her way over to Quinn, who'd hopped out of the truck. She hugged the older woman. "Thank you for coming to pick us up, and for letting us stay on the farm." "Well, hell, of course, sweetie. It's your family's land, after all. I just take care of it. Stay as long as you need. Where's the girl? How's she doing?" Riel shook her head. "Not good. She's in a bad spot." Quinn studied Ray for only a moment when she responded. The bodyguard was a quick read for the older woman who had been here for her since she was a baby. She'd seen her grow, and had supported her through the good times and bad. In her heart, the blonde may not be blood-related, but she was family. Now, she could see the troubled look in those pale blue eyes. Riel Collar was her mother's daughter. She didn't get scared, and yet what the older woman saw flash in those eyes was fear. "We can keep them safe here," assured Quinn, giving her a gentle smile. Riel nodded. She knew they could keep the musician and her brother physically safe. It was Scylla's mental and emotional health the blonde was worried about. "Yeah, Quinn. Let's go home." Quinn smiled at Riel and looked at the boys bringing over the luggage. "Just drop it in the bed, fellas. I hosed it out and put down a tarp so the luggage should stay clean and dry enough." Byron exchanged a glance with Porter, but then shrugged and dropped the luggage in the back, avoiding some type of hitch in the bed. "It's a gooseneck hitch," Porter said to Byron. The artist didn't have a clue what Porter was going on about, but nodded anyway. At last Scylla stepped off the plane, and Riel walked over to her. The musician looked small, scared, and totally foreign in the space. "Come on, let's go to the cabin." She moved to the back passenger door and opened it for Scylla. The musician got in wordlessly, and her brother hopped in beside her. Porter got in the back with them, leaving Riel to ride shotgun. They traveled a couple of hours from the airfield to the vast property that belonged to Willa Collar's family. Scylla didn't know what to expect when Riel told her on the flight that they'd be staying in a cabin. All sorts of images of little log houses in the middle of the woods sprang to mind. Arriving at the property, she never expected it to be an impressive, large log home. She couldn't see much in the dark, but the lights that shone through the large pane windows revealed a vast space. Quinn opened the door and Riel ushered them inside the home. Apparently, she'd already worked out sleeping arrangements with the older woman. Right away, they were led up a set of stairs, taking them to the second level of the home. They stepped into an upper-level area with a view of large paned windows that spanned from the first floor to the roof. A small banister provided protection from falls, and one could look over it to see the great room on the first floor below. Riel led them to the bedrooms, 2 on either side of the living space. "Where are you staying?" Scylla asked in a slight panic as Riel turned to leave after placing the musician's bag in the largest of the bedrooms. "In one of the downstairs bedrooms," Riel answered. "Oh," Scylla answered. She just assumed the bodyguard would have wanted to stay close to her. At least, that's what she'd hoped for. "The fridge up here is stocked, and there's some snacks in the pantry if you want something before you go to bed." "Thanks, but I really just want to try and sleep," Scylla answered. Riel nodded her understanding. "Well, I'll see you in the morning." Scylla nodded. "Sure." She attempted to hide the disappointment from her voice as she added, "Good night, Riel." The bodyguard stepped from the bedroom and met Porter in the living area. "Do you want me to stay up and watch her?" Riel shook her head. "You are here with her all day. You should get some rest." Porter nodded. "So should you." "We're safe here for now," Riel said. "At least from imminent danger. We can both get some rest tonight." Scylla looked around the bedroom. It was simply furnished with a queen bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a nightstand. There was a dresser and a wardrobe along one wall, and a small chair in the corner. She grabbed one of her bags and put it on the chair. After getting some toiletries and something to change into for bed, she made her way to the bathroom down the hall and cleaned up. Looking in the vanity mirror, she was surprised at how haunted she looked. She'd had a terrible day, from the drugs to seeing the video. She hadn't seen what was in the box, but Byron described to her the contents of what he saw when the evidence team carried it out. The entire thing was a horrific nightmare, made worse by the fact that it had been caused by a few simple words. Her words. From her song. Was this the retribution she had always feared would come? She finally made it to the top. Last week she was expecting a chance at an Oscar. She never thought it would come to this. She had walked away from everything she had known for her entire adult life. As she showered, she felt like her very identity was being washed away. When she returned to the bedroom, she got into bed and slept. Her dreams were of dark water and gunshots. Downstairs in the great room, Riel walked over to a leather chair facing the fireplace. She sat down with a glass of scotch and sighed. Even as the fire roared, the blonde hearing the crackle and pop as the flames danced in the fireplace, Riel never felt more cold and alone than she did at that moment. It didn't matter that there was a house full of people around. She felt detached, with such distance from the musician, but she knew Scylla had a lot to process. The next morning, after washing up and getting dressed, Scylla walked into the kitchen area. She searched around a bit and made herself a hot cup of tea. She carried it with her to the edge of the living area and peered over the banister. The great room below was dark, save for the flickering light of a fireplace. Peering out the large windows, she looked out to gently sloping fields beyond the house. The ground was cleared with trees beyond the fence line. As the sun began to rise, she could see several deer grazing. The sight was absolutely breathtaking, and she found herself momentarily at peace. She didn't know how long she stood there, just watching the deer go about their morning. Eventually, one of the larger deer lifted his head and turned it, ears moving. The other deer followed the motion, and as one, they took off across the field and ran back to the safety of the trees. Scylla didn't have to wait long to see what startled them, as 2 people on horseback came into view. The one was the older woman, Quinn. The other was unmistakably Raelle Collar. She watched the woman ride across the field. She shifted, eyes following them until they rode out of sight. Raelle and Quinn walked in the front door, pausing to take their boots off and drop them in a crate at the front door. They moved through the house to the kitchen, following the smell of bacon. "Edwin Collar," Quinn chided. "What do you think you're doing?" Edwin turned around from his place at the stove and blushed slightly. "Well, I figured everyone could have a big breakfast." "Dad, you're in recovery. You're supposed to be resting," fussed Raelle. Edwin turned back to the stove, flipping the pancakes, and then back to Quinn and his daughter. It's just some pancakes, bacon, eggs, and toast. Dad, Raelle exclaimed. You don't need to do that stuff. Now, Ray, quit making a fuss over nothing. Besides, this young woman offered to help out. Raelle's brow rose as she was surprised to see Scylla putting platters of food on the dining room table. Scylla looked up and offered Raelle a shy smile. Quinn glanced at Raelle and then the brunette. Well, Ray, I guess we'd better leave them to it and get washed up. The blonde tore her pale blue gaze away from the brunette and nodded. Yeah. By the time they'd returned, Porter and Byron had joined Scylla and Edwin at the table, and they were all passing around the platters of food and chatting. Porter was asking about the horses, and Edwin was explaining that they were Quinn's animals. I board some. Own some, Quinn said, taking the platter of bacon that was offered to her by the blonde man. You ride? Not in a long time, but I used to every summer. I didn't know that, Byron said, looking over at Porter. The security man nodded his head enthusiastically. My mom's parents lived in Texas, and I'd go there every summer. All the family would meet up, and I'd go riding with my cousins all the time. Scylla smiled, remembering some of the stories Porter had told her over the years, and was surprised that Byron didn't recall them. Then again, Byron had never seemed to notice the blonde despite Porter's multiple attempts at being friendly to her brother. Well, they could use the exercise, so you ought to ride 'em some while you're here, Quinn said. Oh, great, Porter answered, as he swallowed a mouthful of pancakes. What about y'all? Edwin asked, trying to draw the others into conversation. Do either of you ride? Scylla shook her head no, and Byron snorted. Those things are huge, and they bite. I think you're thinking about a donkey or a mule. Well, horses bite sometimes, Raelle answered, but most of the ones here are pretty gentle. And you'll learn quickly which ones to stay away from, Quinn added. Scylla put down her fork and looked at Edwin. You have a beautiful home. Edwin smiled. Well, it's not really mine so much as it's Raelle's. Scylla's eyes widened, and she turned to her bodyguard. Raelle shook her head. It's complicated. This was my grandparents' land, and when they passed, my mother and her sister inherited it together. And when your mom died, you got her half? Byron asked. Right, Raelle answered. But you live here? Porter asked the older woman. Yeah, Quinn answered. I grew up with Willa, and for a while we served together. She knew I wanted to work with horses, so she let me use the land. I can't imagine you not being here, Raelle said. So as long as I have a say, Quinn will be here as long as she wants to take care of the horses. I come up a few times a year to get away from town, maybe do some hunting, and drink my liquor, Quinn added, glaring at Edwin. Just a moonshine, Edwin admitted. He looked at Byron. Do you hunt? Byron blanched but managed to say no. Shame, Edwin said. I've been trying to get Ray to come home and hunt with me, but she's always working. You hunt? Porter asked the blonde. Some, Raelle muttered, and then took a drink of her coffee. Some? Edwin asked, laughing. He looked over at the others. My girl is a fine hunter. Did you see the bear mounted in the living room? Scylla had indeed seen the terrifying-looking bear, and she nodded. Yes, it was huge. Ray was 13 when she took it down. Dad, Raelle protested. They don't want to hear about that stuff. They're city fancies, Quinn added with a look in her eye that Scylla couldn't read, though she sensed it was disapproval, especially toward her. Oh, okay, Edwin said. The conversation moved on to other topics, including Byron's work, and Porter shared some stories about spending his summers in Texas. Two people seemingly absent from the conversation were Scylla and Raelle, who both seemed consumed in their own private thoughts. Byron realized he had just cleaned the food off of his plate. He noticed the awkward silence from his sister and Raelle, too. He knew he had to snap them both out of their own heads. Well, Raelle, that settles it. We need to see if Porter still has what it takes. Can we go see the horses? Raelle nodded. Sure, as long as it's okay with Quinn. Absolutely, Quinn answered. Like I said, they need the exercise, and Ashley hasn't been able to get out here as much as she normally does. Ray, you remember Ashley? Edwin asked. Quinn smirked. I don't know how she would forget. Raelle blushed. Yeah, Is she still working at the veterinarian clinic? Practically owns it, Edwin answered. Who's Ashley? Porter asked. An old friend, Rael answered and stood. If we're going to go see the horses, we might as well go do it now. Quinn looked at Scylla as she stood beside Rael. More than friends, I'd say. How many times did I catch the two of you in the hayloft? Blushing, Rael didn't answer and walked towards the front door. Quinn just laughed and followed the blonde. Edwin shook his head and met the musician's gaze. Don't let Quinn get to you. Her bark is worse than her bite. Right. I've dealt with worse in my profession, Scylla said, glancing at Quinn as she walked away. The musician stood and started picking up a few plates. Let me help you clean up, Mr. Caller. Absolutely not, Edwin answered, grabbing at the plates the brunette had just collected. You go along and see the horses. A walk will do you good. I'm just going to load these in the dishwasher, and then I'll take a nap in the recliner by the fire. Are you sure? Scylla asked. Come on, Syl. Let me show you my skills, Porter said, throwing an arm around the brunette, leading her outside following Ray. Byron smiled and joined the group as they made their way across the field to the barn. As they walked, Rael noticed several horses out grazing. You started the boarders on the winter turnout schedule. No, Quinn answered, brows furrowed. I had them all in just like mine. They heard a sharp whistle and the black and white fur ball rushed past them. Skeet? Yup, Quinn answered with a smile. Goddess, that dog is ancient, Rael said. That was a dog? Byron asked. Yeah, Skeet is one of the best herding dogs you'd ever see. Quinn led them into the stables, and they were immediately hit by the scent of fresh hay and manure. The scent of horses was strong, and Rael found herself taking a calming breath. This reminded her of home, of summers with her mom and Quinn and the horses, nights around the bonfire with her dad and some of his friends. The whistle came again, and this time the dog came to a stop in front of a stunning short, dark-haired woman with dark eyes. She gave it a pat on the head before releasing the dog with a command. Thought that might be you, Quinn said, smirking again. The mystery woman flashed a smile at the unexpected visitor. I've got a lesson with the Johnson's kid at 11, so I thought I'd get started on switching up the turnout and feed schedules, the woman explained, stepping forward to examine the group that had entered the barn. Her brown eyes roamed over Byron and Porter, pausing in recognition at the musician, and then at last turned to Rael. Hello, Ray, she said. Ashley, Rael answered, glancing at the group and then back at the brunette. She made the introductions. I'll go in the office and pick up where you left off, Quinn said, and turned towards the back of the stables. Do you give riding lessons? Porter asked. Yeah, Ashley answered. I teach Western riding here a couple times a week. Still doing barrel training? Rael asked, and then turned to the group. Ash ran the circuit growing up, collected quite a bit of awards. Enough to help my parents get me through college and then vet school, Ashley said. And yes, that's my afternoon appointment. Outdoor ring is a bit muddy, Rael commented. Yeah, I'll do today's run in the indoor ring. You're all welcome to watch. She needs to get used to an audience. Rael glanced over at Scylla and then back to Ashley. Might not be a good idea, Ash. Trying to keep a low profile. Ashley snorted. As if anyone here would dare say anything or even really care about a musician here. Besides Rael, Scylla felt herself bristling, and she was about to say something but stopped herself. She was a guest here. Rael's brow quirked, and the brunette from her past prodded. So, what brings you here? Just checking out the horses, Rael answered. Porter here fancies himself a horseman, Byron said. The blonde blushed. Well, I used to ride quite a bit. Ashley nodded. Okay, Jasper needs some exercise. Take a ride at the breezeway. You'll find him 3 stalls down. She looked at Byron and Scylla, appraising them. Watching or riding? Watching, they both answered. No surprise there, Ashley mumbled, and then turned to Rael with a grin. Ray? I had Zora out this morning. I think I'll just play spectator. Ashley nodded. Okay. Well, I still need to get Annie ready, and the Johnson's kid is on Tornado. Care to lend a hand? I recall you being quite handy. Sure, Rael answered with a smirk, and headed towards the tack room. Ashley's eyes followed the blonde for a moment, and then looked at the Ramshorn siblings. Feel free to look around. Just keep your hands out of any stalls that have bars. It will take us about 20 minutes, and then you can join us in the indoor ring. Just take a left at the breezeway." With that, Ash walked away, boots clumping in the dirt. Byron followed her and gave a low whistle. "Damn," he said. "Where the hell has your girl brought us?" Scylla's brows furrowed. "I'm not so sure I am her girl, Bai. Not after what happened at Fort Salem." The artist shook his head. "Of course you are. You're just both too scared and stubborn to do anything about it." As Ashley and Raelle gathered to tack, the vet looked at her first love. "So why are you really here? It's been years, Ray." Raelle's eyes met her friend's, and she shrugged and hefted the saddle in her arms. "I'm on the job." "You brought them here because they are in danger?" "Scylla's the one in trouble, and yes, I'm trying to keep her safe," Raelle answered. Ashley considered this for a moment and then shook her head. "There's a dozen places you could have taken her. You brought her home, Ray." "Yeah," Raelle answered. "I did." Raelle smiled a sad smile before turning in the direction of Annie's stall. "Love always did look good on you." It turned out that Porter was as good a rider as he claimed to be, and the Ramshorns enjoyed watching the riding lesson from a set of wood bleachers set up along one side of the ring. They were both shocked seeing such a little kid turning and burning, as Ashley had put it. The vet was an amazing horsewoman herself, and Scylla might have been intimidated, had Raelle not sat in the space behind the musician and pulled her back in her arms, explaining now and again what was happening in the ring. For this moment, her worries and insecurities faded away. The smell of rich vanilla and honey laced with a bit of caramel was in the air, and the great room had filled with the pleasing scents of pipe tobacco. Raelle walked up to her father, carrying a couple of mugs of cider, and shook her head. "Dad, you just had a heart attack. Don't you think you should put the pipe away?" Edwin shifted in the leather recliner and motioned for his daughter to join him. Raelle sat down in the matching recliner beside him. Truthfully, she enjoyed the smell and even smoked cigars once in a while. What are we without our rituals? The little things that make us who we are. True, Raelle admitted. She put the mugs on the table between them and pushed a button extending the footrest and relaxed back in her chair. Raelle reached for her cider and took a few sips, staring into the dancing flames of the fireplace. She was worried about Scylla, how the musician was doing outside of her world. Was she struggling with her identity now that she'd walked away from the concert and the photo shoots, the interviews and the limelight? As if reading her thoughts, Edwin spoke. "Your guests seem to be settling into things here. I think they like it here." "What's not to like?" Raelle asked, her voice thoughtful. In the week they'd been at the farm, everyone had seemed to settle into a routine. Byron and Porter had gone into town with Quinn a couple days after they'd arrived and had returned with art supplies. The artist had taken to painting landscapes and the animals around the farm. He'd even started a few portraits. Porter spent a lot of time with Ashley and Quinn working with the horses. Raelle had found one of her old guitars for Scylla to use when she felt like playing. Although the musician seemed happy with the instrument, Raelle hadn't heard her play it yet. Instead, she often found that Scylla spent a lot of the time in the loft of the home, which had been converted into a reading nook, or walking around the property. "Your girl is troubled, though. It looks like she's carrying around the weight of the world." "I know," Raelle answered. "I'm trying to give her some space." Edwin puffed on his pipe for a long moment and then put it down. "I don't think she needs space. I think she needs you." "Dad, I don't know." "You know you love her, don't you? I mean, that's obvious to everyone. You need to tell her before it's too late, before she disappears into whatever cocoon she's trying to spin around herself." "Maybe." "She's a nice woman, Raelle. She needs protecting, but she needs more than that. If you are in, be all in." Raelle nodded, lost in her thoughts as she sat with her father, enjoying the cider and the smoke. Porter bounded up the loft steps and stopped at the top, finally finding his friend. "Syl, there you are." Scylla looked up from her book, a look of annoyance on her face. Byron had been up here only a half hour before doing the same thing, checking up on her. Placing the bookmark in her book, she tried to smile at her childhood friend. "How are you, Porter?" "Good, good." The blonde looked around the room and Scylla sighed. "Did you need anything?" Porter shook his head. Nah, we just making sure that you were doing okay. I know that was a lot at Fort Salem. Yeah, it was, Scylla said. Thank you for helping me. Porter smiled and blushed. Anytime. You know I love you. I do. And you know I think of you as another brother. Porter nodded. So how about going for a ride? Scylla laughed. I don't know about that. The horses are pretty, but I don't really think I want to go riding. At least not today. There's some beautiful spots on the property that you can't really get to unless you're on a horse. You should go at Rael sometime. There's just one place on the hill that you can see for miles and miles. Maybe you should take Byron up there. He'd probably love to paint it. Huh, Porter said, face turning grimsome. I don't know about that. Scylla smirked slightly. Goddess, Porter, are you ever going to make a move? Porter shook his head. Your brother never noticed me. Hell, he still thinks I want you. The musician shrugged. So make him notice. How? Get him out of his comfort zone. Get him in a position where he has to pay attention to you. Maybe, Porter said. He looked up at Scylla. You sure you don't want... Take Byron, Scylla said, and opened her book. Are you sure this is a good idea? Byron asked, looking up at the horse. He was fairly tall, and yet the beast seemed to tower over him. He was absolutely terrified. Porter looked at Byron and then at the horse. The old boy's name was Winston, and according to Ashley, he was one of the horses they used when she taught clinics with kids who had disabilities. He was a gentle soul, and he looked at Byron with infinite patience. Yes, Porter nodded. Winston will take good care of you. He looks like he wants to eat me, Byron muttered. Horses are herbivores. The artist snorted. Well, maybe this one makes an exception. Porter resisted rolling his eyes and watched Byron patiently, waiting for the artist to decide to try and mount the horse. Finally, he took a step forward and listened as Porter gave him instructions. Once he was astride Winston, Byron looked down at Porter and asked nervously, Are you sure this is worth it? It's a beautiful spot, Porter promised. You couldn't just take some pictures for me? Byron muttered and watched as Porter smoothly mounted Jasper. A picture can't do this view justice. Besides, it's just across the field and up the hill. It's an easy ride, just a bitch to walk. Fine, Byron said, nervous as the horse shifted under him. Let's just go. Porter grinned and turned Jasper to the field. As they walked the horses, Porter gave Byron instructions and pointers here and there. As they got close to the hill, Porter moved Jasper beside Winston. You'll want to lean forward just a bit as the hill gets steep, and don't squeeze too tight or he'll think you want him to go faster. Byron blenched and loosened the death grip his legs had around the horse. Porter resisted a laugh as the artist yelped when Winston lengthened his stride. At last they reached the top of the hill, and Porter brought his horse to a stop just before they entered a wooded area. They turned the horses to look back down at the field, the stables, and the house beyond, and Porter heard the artist sigh. God, that's amazing. That's nothing, Porter said, looking at Byron. He nudged Jasper forward and said, We got just a little bit more to go. It gets a bit rocky up here. Let Winston find his own way. The horses made their way through dense trees, and just when Byron thought they'd never stop climbing, they'd reached a level area, and Porter rode out towards a small overlook. Byron rode up beside him with Winston and peered out. The view of the mountains and the valleys was breathtaking. There was even a little stream off in the distance, and the sun made the water sparkle. He could only imagine what it would look like in the summer or the fall. He forgot about being nervous on Winston and reached for the phone in his pocket. He took several pictures at several different angles. Porter was right. He would be able to paint it from memory with the help of the pictures. But had he just received pictures, the artist would have never been able to capture the true beauty of the spot. He could even see himself painting a scene from the view between Winston's ears. It would be an interesting perspective for sure. After several minutes of taking photos and just looking at the scene, he turned his eyes on Porter. The blonde looked totally at home on the horse, and Byron noticed just how his blue eyes sparkled. Can you move in front of me? Byron asked. I just want a few shots with the horse in front for perspective. Porter moved Jasper, and Byron took several more shots with his phone. At one point, the blonde looked dead into the camera, eyes shining, cheeks flushed from the cold, and Byron realized that he was holding his breath. He was surprised by the sudden itch to paint the blonde. I think I've got what I need. Porter nodded and moved his horse beside Winston. Okay, so a bit more tricky going down. Byron's brow quirked, and Porter continued. You're going to want to give Winston his head and let him find his own way. As he starts down the steepest part of the hill, lean back. If you feel like you're slipping, no shame in grabbing the horn. As Porter made his way through the trees with Jasper, he smirked to himself. The instructions had been a bit over the top, but judging by the way he'd noticed Byron looking at him while taking pictures, he figured it was time to put something else in the artist's mind. Scylla had been right. All it took was a shift in focus. They made their way back to the stables without incident, mainly because Byron had stopped thinking so much about staying on the horse and more about the childhood friend beside him. Porter had always been closer to Scylla than he had been with him. In fact, he'd almost seemed shy at times. Byron had always assumed it was because Porter was nervous about how he'd react to knowing that he had a crush on his sister, but now he wondered. Once at the stables, Porter stopped Jasper and dismounted easily. He turned to Byron, but the artist seemed to be stuck once again. Porter walked over to Winston and stroked the animal's neck while looking up at Byron. Need some help? Byron gave a slight nod, and Porter once again provided instructions. All in all, it started out well, but just as he was about to remove his foot from the stirrup, it got caught and Winston shifted. The artist started to fall back and Porter caught him, hands holding onto the artist's ass. Once he was safely on both of his feet, Porter let go, and Byron smiled shyly. So, what do you think? Good scene to paint? Yeah, Byron said. The scene between the horse's ears would be a nice painting. But it wasn't the one he had formed in his head. No. First, he had a new portrait on his mind. Pretty gorgeous. Porter took Winston's reins. Well, I'll take care of this fella for you. Okay, Byron answered and walked away. His legs were a bit unsteady, and he wondered if it was the ride or something else. Riel was usually the first to wake in the house. She would walk around inside the house to check the doors and the windows for tampering. Next, she would do a sweep outside, checking the vehicles in the driveway, and even weather just out of habit. Everyone might be safe here, away from the city, but she couldn't forget there was still a threat out there against the person the person she loved. On the east side of the house, on the porch, her mother had a log-style swing set that could seat two. She had it installed years ago so she could watch the sunrise and the beautiful show that nature would provide. Surprisingly, who she saw sitting there was the musician herself, wide awake and just staring into the sky. It looked as if she just missed the sun rising this morning. The clouds in the sky still held a gentle pink, instead of the usual white highlights to the light blue backdrop of the sky that morning. Before heading out there to join her, she noticed Scylla with a little red on her nose and cheeks. The brunette always lost the time when it came to cold weather. She could be out there all day if she had her way. Riel went to the kitchen and prepared 2 hot cups of tea for her and the musician. While the tea seeped, the blonde put on her dad's brown fleece-lined jacket. She finished fixing the tea and headed towards the door. The blonde strode along the porch, her boots thudding on the wooden planks alerting Scylla to her approach. The musician watched the blonde taking in her simple jeans and extra-large coat. The sun had come up just enough that Riel's hair glinted in the sun. The view was just as breathtaking as the sunrise had been earlier that morning. Riel wordlessly handed the brunette a mug of tea and, seeing a book on the swing beside the musician, decided to purge on the porch rail instead, stretching one leg out along its length. Scylla watched emotion swallowing at how Riel's presence filled her entire world. She felt a familiar calm, the strength the blonde had offered. She knew that everyone had been tiptoeing around her since Fort Salem. Everyone but Riel. Instead, the blonde had given her time and space. Scylla looked down at the steaming cup cradled in her hands and back up at Riel with her own mug. Suddenly, she realized that they were finally having tea. She didn't have a clue what to say. So much had happened, and it looked like Riel had come into her life to save her from it. but a part of the musician wondered if she deserved it. If all that happened was her punishment, and involving Rael would only drag her down too, into a hell the blonde didn't deserve. Rael drank her tea, watching the brunette get lost in her own thoughts. She'd noticed the musician doing that a lot over the past few days. Sometimes it looked as though Scylla had resigned to accept what was happening. It looked as though she'd accepted this chaos and torment and made it her companion. That worried the blonde. No one deserved this. To have her art be used to destroy others, to be hunted. The bodyguard cleared her throat, getting the brunette's attention. When she felt the azure gaze on her, she nodded to the book on the seat beside the brunette. That one of the books she picked up in Fort Salem? Yeah, Scylla said. She smiled sadly, remembering the teen cashier and what she'd said. Slowly she took a sip of the tea and let her mind wander. Before the brunette could get lost again, Rael spoke up. What's it about? Oh, it's a series of essays about Emily Dickinson and her personal life. Rael nodded. Her liaison with Gilbert? Yeah. Speaking of that, I picked up a book for you. Oh? Rael asked with a smile. Scylla frowned. Unfortunately, it was in the other box. Rael nodded, knowing Scylla was talking about the box the psycho had gotten hold of and used. The books had been found, dropped in a dumpster at a nearby McDonald's. They had been taken to the crime lab as evidence. What was it? Rael asked. Scylla took another drink of her tea and then met Rael's gaze. Love letters of Vida and Virginia. Sounds interesting, Rael answered. She recalled their conversation out at the hammock and how Scylla had joked about her being Vida. She looked at the musician and took a sip of tea, considering how to say what she felt. Finally, she put her cup on the rail and stood up. She moved over to the swing and picked up the book and sat beside the musician. Scylla felt a shift in Rael's mood and turned slightly on the swing to face her. She reached for the book and Rael handed it over, brushing her fingers over Scylla's. The musician felt that familiar jolt, the immediate need she always had when in close proximity to her bodyguard. Normally, she saw the same desire reflected in Rael's pale blue eyes, but today her eyes seemed thoughtful, darker. She was sure she glimpsed something else beneath the icy surface. Despite herself, her breath hitched and she shivered. You want to go inside? You must be freezing out here. Scylla smiled. You mean you're cold? Rael laughed softly. That too. Scylla shifted on the swing and leaned into Rael. The blonde automatically wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. It's beautiful here, Scylla said, trying to tempt the bodyguard into staying outside. She was afraid if they went into the cabin, they'd be interrupted, as they had been multiple times. Although the blonde had been content to let Scylla have her space, Byron and Porter constantly tried to engage her into conversation or their activities. They seemed intent on keeping her distracted. Yeah, Rael answered. She held Scylla, feeling the tension in the musician, and gently rubbed her back. For the record, I would have liked the book. Might have given me some pointers. They both laughed, and Rael continued, voice low. When I got off of the elevator, and I couldn't find you anywhere, it terrified me. Rael, I'm sorry. I would have never been able to forgive myself for not being there if something had happened to you, Rael continued, interrupting Scylla's apology. And I can't imagine not having you in my life. Rael shifted, meeting the cerulean gaze of the musician. Syl, I'm in love with you. Goddess knows I've tried to fight these feelings. I'm supposed to keep you safe, and I thought loving you would interfere with that, make me weak when I needed to be strong. In reality, it's when I'm with you. That is the time I feel I'm at my best. As the bodyguard spoke, the harder Scylla's heart pounded in her chest. Overwhelmed by hearing the words she had longed for Rael to finally say to her, she felt her eyes begin to water. There was still that guilt, that voice in the back of her head saying, You don't deserve this kind of love. Hey, what's wrong? I didn't want to upset you. Rael held the side of Scylla's face, wiping her tears away from her cheek. No, nothing is wrong. This is just so much. The musician sniffled and smiled behind her tears. I am so in love with you. Another flood of guilt came over her, making her sad again. There's stuff in my past. I want to tell you everything. Overwhelmed, Scylla started to cry. I don't want to hide anything from you. Riel couldn't stand to watch her break down like that. She pulled the musician in tight. Shh, look, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. What matters is us and who we are now. You are a beautiful person, inside and out. You're not a poster that some asshole made up. There's still so much of you that I want to get to know. This past, when you are ready, I'm here. I'm yours. Scylla clung to Riel, allowing herself to hope, to believe that maybe things would be okay. If giving up her music career was the retribution for what she had done, it would be worth it. She could make a new life with Riel. Neither paid attention to how much time had passed, but eventually Edwin found them in the swing, frozen, still holding onto one another, and insisted they return inside the cabin to get warm. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.